the module where we talk about communication and conflict management. In this module, your learning outcomes will be to define communication and discuss its role in organizations. And when the module is over, you'll also be able to define conflict and explain how it could affect organizational effectiveness. You'll be able to explain how managers can deal with conflict effectively. You'll be able to explain the role of negotiation in an organization, and you'll also be able to discuss managerial issues when it comes to negotiation. Let's move ahead. So what is communication in organizations? Organizational communication effectively means how the members of that organization talk to each other, how they exchange information, how they establish a common understanding, whether they use technology, meetings, talking in the corridor. Effectively, what do they do to communicate with each other? You have what's called interpersonal communication in an organization, and this is how individuals communicate between themselves. So how does person A communicate with person B? You need to have an information source. So one person will have a piece of information. They will encode that information and they will make it ready to submit to another person. They then transmit that information to another person through a given channel. The information then goes to the receiver who decodes it. They then either give feedback or they hear a bunch of noise. So for example, you might say that a leader of a team wants to hand a piece of information that's useful to a project to an individual on their team. This leader will decide what information needs to be sent. They then create it in a language that they know the person, or they hope the person that will receive it will understand. They transmit that information over a certain channel, and that could be verbally, in a meeting, over lunch, through an email, on Slack. Then the receiver receives the information, they decode it, so they try and make sense of what they've received from the sender. They then either give feedback, I understood it, or I didn't understand it, or I have more questions, and they try to block out the noise that is all around them. So let's have a look at this in a model. What we can see here that enhances what we've already discussed is that there is an intended meaning that the source has, and there's a perceived meaning that the receiver actually has. So when the leader is giving instructions to the member of their team, their intending meaning could be one thing, but the receiver could actually perceive that meaning to be something else completely. And what happens is that when the receiver receives the information, they actually have a lot of noise they have to deal with, from things like physical distractions, the phone is ringing, somebody comes to their desk, semantic problems, there might be cultural differences, they might have, they might experience mixed messages, or they may not actually be able to give any feedback, or maybe that the person who they're receiving information from is either higher up or lower down in the hierarchy from them, and this impacts how they receive that information. Delving into communication in a bit more detail, let's have a look at what is effective communication and what is efficient communication. So effective communication is that the intended meaning of the source is the same as the perceived meaning as a receiver. So the manager or the leader of the team had an intention for the information that they were sending and of what it means, and that when the person heard that piece of information, they understood it as the leader had intended it. And then efficient communication is actually the minimum cost in terms of resources expended. So for example, the leader of the team might be sitting in an office and the team member could be sitting on the other side of the building. The minimum cost in terms of resources would be for the leader to either send an email or make a phone call, but they would expend more resources if they actually get up from their desk, walk down the hall and physically see the person. So that's the difference between effective and efficient communication. There are many different communication channels in an organization. There are formal, informal, quasi-formal and barriers to information, to interpersonal communication. So formal channels could be emails using a certain system like Slack or Trello. Informal channels could be a chat in the corridor, it could be a lunch with a colleague, and quasi-formal channels would be a mixture of the two, so you could have a working lunch with a colleague. There are also some barriers to interpersonal communication. Can you think what they could be? Some barriers to interpersonal communication could be that you may want to speak to the CEO about something, but you may not be in the right level of hierarchy in order to have an informal chat with them. So you may have to go through formal channels, but even then, your email could be missed if the owner of the company or the CEO doesn't know who you are. So can you think of other barriers to interpersonal communication other than the example that I gave? We've looked at communication, now let's look at conflict. So for our purposes, conflict is defined as when two or more people disagree about an issue of organizational substance, or they experience antagonism. So can you think of a time in your life where you have experienced conflict? Now, it's safe to say that conflict is a part of human life. Where we have any kind of communication and interaction, there will be conflict. But conflict doesn't have to be something negative, although it could be an expression of unfriendliness, hostility, negative attitudes, aggression, rivalry, and misunderstanding. There are very, very substantive conflict and emotional conflict. So a substantive conflict is a fundamental disagreement over goals or the means for their accomplishment. And an emotional conflict are interpersonal difficulties that arise over feelings of anger, mistrust, fear, resentment, and dislike. So for example, let's take our leader that is giving their team member some pointers and notes on how to do their job. The person in the team may fundamentally disagree on how this advice is going to help them achieve the bigger goal of the organization. That's a substantive conflict. But it becomes emotional if they feel like their manager or their leader doesn't trust them. I hope that difference makes sense. In terms of culture and conflict, there is what we would call national cultural diversity, international cultural diversity, and expatriate cross-cultural adaptation. So national cultural diversity talks about the culture within a country itself. So what does it consist of? How is it different from region to region? With international cultural diversity, this is looking at how cultures differ across different countries, and what can be seen as an asset and a liability to each of those cultures can create some conflict. And often when you have people in businesses that actually move from one country to another, so let's say somebody moves from France to India, there could be a time of conflict during their move when they are finding it difficult to adapt to the culture they've just been expatriated into. Now conflict, we discovered earlier, can be quite negative or destructive, but it can also be constructive. So conflict is constructive when it delivers positive benefits to the group. So a disagreement in a group could actually help them to achieve their goals better. But then conflict becomes destructive in a group or a team when actually it works to the disadvantage of the group or team that is having that conflict. So it has a negative effect on what they're trying to achieve. There are several different views on conflict. So the traditional view is that all conflict was actually seen to be bad. It was viewed negatively and it was used in the same sentence as terms like violence and destruction. Then came along the human relations view, and this argued that conflict is actually a natural occurrence in small groups and in organizations. Some conflict can't be avoided and it's accepted, and there are actually times when conflict can benefit the group's performance. The modernist view, or the interactionist view of conflict, is that actually conflict isn't only positive but also necessary for a group or team to perform effectively. It actually encourages group leaders to maintain ongoing minimum amount of conflict in order to keep the group viable, self-critical, and to increase the group or team's performance. There are very different views on conflict right there. So we can see that when we compare the traditional view to the current view, the traditional view says that conflict is avoidable, it's caused by management error or terrible organizational design, it disrupts the organization, it is the task of management to eliminate the conflict, and optimal organizational performance happens when conflict is eliminated. Whereas actually in the current view, the idea here is that conflict is unavoidable, it's inevitable, it will always happen. And it may arise from many different causes, much like organizational culture, differences in goals, differences in opinions or perceptions and values of different people, and that's okay. That it actually contributes to organizational performance to a degree, and managers are tasked to manage the level of conflict and find a resolution. And optimal organizational performance requires at least a little bit of conflict. So now you've seen the traditional and the current view of conflict. What do you think? Is it something we need or something we really should avoid? Now let's have a look at the positive and negative effects of conflict. On the positive side, when you have healthy conflict, it can increase involvement from different team members. It can eventually result in cohesion of the team. There's a lot of innovation and creativity. There is vibrancy in the organization. The identity of the individual and the group increases. They're able to grow personally and actually clarify key issues. So in an organization where people don't shy away from conflict, it can actually be very positive. But on the negative side, some conflict can lead to unresolved anger. There are some personality clashes. Maybe some teams become very inefficient. People's psychological well-being is threatened. Some people may end up having some low self-esteem or lower self-esteem as a result of conflict. It could also be a waste of resources. It could create a negative climate, and it could actually disrupt the cohesion of a group. So you can see that actually when you look at positive impacts of conflict, that's a very contemporary view of conflict, whereas with the negative side of it, that's a very traditional view of conflict. Now let's have a look at the two phases of conflict, its impact on performance and intensity of the conflict, and where you would say the healthiest kind of conflict needs to live. So in the middle of the bell curve, you've got the healthiest way of conflict, where the impact on performance is positive and the intensity is on the medium side, which basically means there are moderate levels of conflict and they're actually quite constructive. But when there's a low intensity of conflict but negative performance, it means conflict is very, very destructive to the organization. But if you have a negative impact on performance and high intensity of conflict, that is seen as too much conflict, and it can be also incredibly destructive on a team and on an organization. There are different types of conflict situations that managers and leaders can face in an organization. The first is vertical conflict, where there is conflict either from the manager to the team member or vice versa, or from the manager themselves and to their superiors. We also have horizontal conflict, where conflict exists between peers to peers. Line staff conflict, which means I'm a leader, I have a manager who I'm managing, and they actually have a conflict with their team member. And also a conflict in roles, which means either something like we're both doing the same job, I think I should be doing a different job to that person, or that person's role is encroaching on my role. So very different situations faced by managers when it comes to conflict, and when it comes to handling that conflict, there are many different ways it can be handled as well. Let's briefly look at the different stages that conflict can exist in. There are certain conditions that need to exist for conflict to happen. This then results in either perceived conflict or felt conflict. So perceived conflict is where you look at a situation and think, there is something happening here that is conflicting, and I can see the actual evidence for it. And felt conflict is when your emotions are a bit more involved and you can feel how the conflict is impacting you emotionally. Then the conflict itself will manifest. There will be either a repression or a resolution of that conflict, and then the aftermath is either going to be positive or negative. There are very different, this process of conflict actually will take you through how conflict can differ and develop in an organization. So latent conflict is when it exists, but nobody actually talks about it. So it's almost like dormant conflict. It then becomes perceived conflict when people start discussing it, felt conflict when people start feeling the impact of it on their jobs and their lives, manifest conflict probably when they start discussing it actively and maybe they start arguing or start resolving, and then it can turn to either functional or dysfunctional conflict, as we've seen earlier. Let's explore that in a bit more detail. So the stage 1 of the conflict process is latent conflict. So 2 or more parties need each other to achieve the desired objective. There is potential for conflict. So this latent conflict often comes about when change happens. It's likely to be caused by, say, something like a budget cutback, a change in the direction of the organisation, a change in personal goals of the people, or the assignment of the project that has been given to them. Then you move on to stage 2, which is perceived conflict. So this is when each member becomes aware of the problem. They have tension between them and people start worrying about what will happen, but nobody at this stage actually feels overly threatened. Then you move on to stage 3, which is felt conflict. At this stage, both parties become quite emotionally involved and they become focused on their differing of opinion and their opposing interests. They then start creating a lot of tension and frustration, and people start actually showing some emotional commitment to this particular piece of conflict. The next stage is the manifest conflict stage. And this is when the parties start engaging in actions that actually help them achieve their own objectives and ruin the objectives of others. So the behavior in this stage could be very subtle, indirect, and highly controlled forms of communication, or it could be quite direct, aggressive, and a little bit volatile. So at this stage, the conflict or the organization can actually start feeling threatened as well. And the outcome stage, which is stage 5, is the conflict finally results in an outcome, and this could be functional or it could be dysfunctional. So when it's handled well, it hopefully will be functional, but if it isn't handled well, it can be terribly dysfunctional for either the team, the organization, or indeed the individual. Now let's look at the different levels of conflict that can exist in an organization. So the individual levels of conflict could be intra or inter. So intra-individual conflict is conflict between 2 people, and inter-individual conflict is conflict within one person in themselves. Then you have organizational level conflict, and that's inter and intra as well. So inter-organizational conflict is conflict within one organization, and intra-organizational conflict is a conflict between different organizations. And you have the same in groups. So either the groups can have conflict within themselves, which is intra-group conflict, or they might be having conflict with different groups, which is intergroup conflict. There are very different ways that you can resolve conflict, and let's have a look at some of those styles. And there are 4 key thinkers that we'll be referring to. So Blake says that there are 5 ways that you can resolve conflict. You can either force it, you can withdraw from it, you can be quite soothing, you can be compromising, and you can be problem solving. Thomas, on the other hand, thinks there are only 2 ways. You can either be assertive or you can be cooperative, and that's how you resolve conflict. Raheem says that there are actually 5 ways to resolve conflict. You can be very integrating, you can be quite obliging, you can be compromising, you can be dominating, and you can be avoiding. And finally, Pace says there are also 5 different ways that you can resolve conflict. You can either be a competitor or a collaborator. You can be avoider, and an accommodator, and a compromiser. So what similarities do you see between these different conflict resolution styles? Some similarities here are things like a forcing style from Blake and a competitor style from Pace. Or you can see that there's a compromising style from Blake and Raheem, and I would say that an accommodator is also a type of compromising style. There are many things that you can do to deal with conflict. Here are a few. You could first of all play the victim and say nothing. You can complain and say everything is being done to you. You could also leave the situation completely, so decide that you no longer want to be involved in this conflict. You could change yourself, so you could decide, actually, I'm going to let it go, I'm going to change my position, or I'm going to choose to see the other side of the story. Or you can actually become very confrontational. That doesn't mean you have to be aggressive, but you could also decide to address the issue openly and actually speak candidly to the other party. Now let's look a little bit deeper into the 5 conflict resolution styles, and they actually vary in their degrees of assertiveness and cooperation. So the first style is to cooperation, and this is how much an individual tries to satisfy and consider the other person's needs. How far are you willing to cooperate with the other person? Then you have assertiveness. This is when a person attempts to satisfy their own concerns. They're only concerned about themselves and resolving the conflict that will benefit them. The other styles that you have are competitive, avoiding, and compromising. So let's have a look at all those conflict resolution styles in a quadrant. So they fall into levels of concern, either for themselves, well, just for themselves, if the concern for themselves is high or low, and then have a look at whether somebody is a compromiser, if they are low on compromise or high on compromise. So in the lower left-hand corner, if somebody has low concern for themselves and are low on compromise, they're typically an avoider and they will comply with everything that's happened. If their concern for themselves is high, but their compromising levels are low, they actually could be quite competitive and very tough to go into battle with. If their concern for themselves is high, but they also have a concern for others that's also quite high, they could actually become a collaborator, so they want to actively solve the problem with the other person. But if their concern for themselves is low, but the concern for the other is high, they then become an accommodator and they want to help the other person more than they want to help themselves. The competitive approach to conflict resolution is actually very assertive and sometimes uncooperative. It can be quite a power-orientated style, so people that generally operate from this position of power also feel like they have a lot of persuasion ability. You can use this to your advantage when you want to have action taken quickly, or if there is an emergency that needs decisiveness now. But sometimes if you use this competitive conflict resolution style, in some situations it can lead people to feel quite alienated. The collaborative style, on the other hand, is more assertive and cooperative. So it basically tries to meet the need of every person involved in that situation. So you would need to be somebody with a collaborative style that would have to look at every single viewpoint in order to find the best resolution for the problem. The compromising style actually sits between assertiveness and cooperativeness. And a compromising person wants to make sure they'll find a solution that actually helps everyone. So it's a win-win, win-win-win, depending on how many people are involved. And compromising is best used when there are two people with equal power and they're actually committed to a goal that is mutually exclusive for both of them. An accommodating style is actually the opposite of competing. It's not assertive, but it is cooperative. This means that actually the person who has the accommodating style wants to meet the needs of others, but at the expense of their own needs. So the conflict is seen as a social and emotional issue, and it can be resolved through support and understanding. And actually this style is best used when you want to create harmony, and it's actually more important for you to avoid conflict. And this style is best used when you want to help your employees to develop and to actually learn from their mistakes. Now let's have a look at confronting when it comes to conflict management and resolution. We can look at confronting in the forms of the 4 C's. The first thing you do is you connect. So you establish a rapport with the other party because you address the issues between you openly. So you assert yourself, not in a competitive or aggressive manner, but you're the first person to say something about this conflict. The second C is to clarify. So you seek to understand the other person by actively listening to them and hearing their point of view. Then you move on to confirming, where you reach a mutual agreement where both parties want to actually collaborate towards resolution. And then you move into contracting, which is to negotiate the agreements for any future conflict or misunderstanding, or create a conclusion to your conflict. The avoiding style of conflict resolution is actually very unassertive and incredibly uncooperative. It basically means this person who's avoiding will decide that they don't want to have any involvement with the conflict. They effectively just bury their head in the sand. And it's not like you would never use this style of conflict resolution. In fact, you can when you decide that the conflict is actually not that important to you. So you can let that one slide. Now, it's great to be used when you want to reduce tension and just get harmony and composure back in the team. But remember that this avoiding style, if used too much, can actually be seen as a sign of weakness. Now here's an interesting question. How do you arrive at win-win outcomes when it comes to conflict resolution? There are many different ways you can do that. The first one is to understand that you can't have all the answers. If you don't have all the answers, which is likely that you don't, it's best to involve other people and allow both of you to find the answers. One great thing to do is to ask questions and to understand the other person, and actually in the coaching module we'll look a little bit more about how to ask open questions. You must also be prepared to compromise or make a deal, because sometimes in certain conflicts you're not able to get everything you want, so you must be able to decide on what things you will compromise on. Then listening actively is really important, especially when you've asked a question. Listening actively is very, very key. And empathizing is an incredible skill, because this allows you to see the other person's point of view without compromising on your own. Having everybody involved in the conflict have an input, actually look at a solution and state the reason for this solution, and actually be able to deal with emotional issues. This is a great way of arriving at a win-win outcome for everyone involved, and a great way to demonstrate the kind of leader that you are. When you have intergroup conflict, there are different approaches that you can use to actually resolve it. You can look at avoiding altogether the problem and hoping it goes away. Maybe it's too small for you to deal with anyway. You can look at actively solving the problem by getting all the parties together in a group. You can smooth it over by having a very frank discussion with everyone. You can see who's willing to compromise. You can use more resources to get there. You might want to redesign the organization so the right people are in the right groups. Or you might want to create additional or even new goals to make sure that a conflict like this doesn't arise again. Let's have a look at some of those in detail. So problem solving is actually considered to be one of the most effective approaches available, and to resolve conflict, because it looks at actually having a win-win and looking at the common interests of both of those conflicting parties. So when you have a problem-solving strategy, you want to integrate the needs of both parties, and both parties will need to work together in order to become satisfied with the outcome of the conflict. When it comes to organizational redesign, this is a more far-reaching solution to a conflict. So this is usually used when the source of conflict comes from the coordination of work amongst different departments or divisions. So the problem is quite a big problem, it spans more than two people. One way that you could redesign your organization is actually to reduce task interdependence between groups and give each group a key and clear responsibility. Another way is to transfer and exchange members from conflicting groups. There are many different creative ways you can go about an organizational redesign. The subordinate goal solution in a group is actually appealing to subordinate goals to find a way of combining the efforts of both conflicting parties to then realize the goal that wants to be achieved. For example, the survival of the organization can actually be a superordinate goal. So you will create this awareness that if the two parties don't resolve the conflict, the survival of the organization will actually be jeopardized. So it actually forces them to find a resolution, because their conflict jeopardizes the entire harmony of the organization. When it comes to expanding resources, this is the extent to which scarce resources can actually cause conflict. So removing their scarcity can help resolve the conflict. So for example, if there's a conflict in a team because one budget is being given to a team that's larger than another, you can actually either remove budget management from those teams or actually increase the budget for each person, or have the same budget for every single person in that department. When it comes to smoothening as a way of solving a conflict, this is the process by which you play down the differences between the individuals or the groups, and you actually highlight the common interests they have between themselves. So when you emphasize similarities between conflicting parties, they start to see where their shared viewpoints are, and it can start to reduce intensity and avoid the conflict escalating. But this might not be the final way to resolve the conflict. This is almost a stopgap and a way to start conflict resolution and create a foundation of harmony before you can move into resolving the actual conflict. When it comes to resolving conflict, especially when you are the person who is the leader, or even if you are the person that's involved in the conflict, so you're not mediating two people, just remember that it helps to stay calm. It helps to not allow your emotions to come to the fore, and either you shout or you cry. And don't assume that people are actually being difficult intentionally. It might be that they actually have decent intention that would eventually help you. And if you think things are going to be tense, then definitely find a place where you can privately have a conversation. You may decide that actually setting some ground rules is a smart way to deal with that conflict. So you will decide between you that you won't raise your voice, you're not debating, that you only speak for yourself when you use I phrases. You are going to confront the issue. You're not going to be targeting people and their behaviors and their characteristics. And you want to be either maintaining at least or enhancing the self-esteem of the people involved. When it comes to the strategy of a business, here is how conflict can move up the chain in the business. So in terms of business relationships, you need to have mutual expectations to make sure that the goals that you've set yourself are going to be achieved, but also that when it comes to resolving conflict, you know exactly what the expectations are of everyone involved. You then have rules of engagement. So, things like not raising your voice could be one, the location where you are could be another. You then have the accountability of each person. So what is each person's role and what they're accountable for? And then you would look at the business priorities and the focus that you have. So when you come to creating a conflict strategy, taking these 4 points into account will help you come up with a very smart strategy to resolve conflict. Let's now look at negotiation and the different goals of a negotiation. One goal could be a substance goal, and this is really looking at what's the final content outcome. So it could be, if you are negotiating a salary, then the final salary you negotiate is your substance goal. The relationship goal is when you are aiming to maintain the relationship with the person that you are negotiating with. And another goal could be that you actually have an effective negotiation, so at the end of it you actually come to an agreement quite quickly. When it comes to negotiating, your best alternative to the negotiated agreement is what you can use as a compromise. So if you decide that the final salary isn't going to happen the way you intended, maybe your best alternative would be to have a salary increase in 6 months' time and not today. So that way you actually get to an agreement quicker that you're happy with and your counterpart is happy with. But in a classic two-party negotiation, you have the bargaining zone and you also have arbitration. So the bargaining zone is the elements both parties have to bargain with. So what will they put on the table? in order to achieve something in return. And arbitration refers to having a third party come in and actually manage that negotiation for them. When you look at the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, you start off with your counterpart and you. Okay, you then have the best alternative to the negotiation. You then have the zone of possible agreement, and then you actually receive or achieve an outcome that gives you the best alternative to the negotiated agreement you were hoping for. So your zone of possible agreement is where you will explore and you bargain in order to get the best result for yourself. Some strategies to consider when you're looking at the best alternative to the negotiation of the negotiated agreement is to look at the other side and what their best alternative is. If theirs is good, you might want to consider what you can do to actually change it. You will have to look at whether you actually want to include your best alternative. And if the other side thinks that you have no alternatives, then it's better for you to actually suggest that you have those alternatives. But if you think you can get better for yourself, then keep your alternatives to yourself, and that is your bargaining power if the negotiation continues for longer. In terms of managers resolving conflict, here are some things that you can follow in order to become a better resolver of conflict. Definitely be candid and be open. So when issues surface, put them on the table. You have to be receptive, so be open to all competing points of view and make sure that everyone knows their points of view are accepted. You depersonalize it, so you look at everything from a business case and a business perspective rather than from individuals' characteristics and performance. You have to be clear about the decision-making rules of the game. So will the issue that you're discussing be decided unilaterally? Is there a consultative approach, or will it be by consensus? You have to outlaw triangulation, which means making sure that each person is communicating with everybody else and not going off in a group and forming subgroups in order to resolve the conflict, but actually not resolving the conflict. One of the key skills of a leader is to listen well. So one of your listening skills will be to actually listen to the information, decode it, and give feedback to make sure that what you've heard is exactly what the person who was speaking to you has intended. So to do this, you would hear the information and you would say, if I understood correctly, this is what you told me, and you repeat it back to them and they will say yes or no. Another thing that you can do to handle conflict well as a manager is actually hold people accountable and ask them to develop solutions and be responsible for the actual outcome. And finally, recognize and reward successful conflict management when you can, because an organization will thrive on healthy conflict and achieve its goals better. And that brings us to the end of our module on communication and conflict management.